They say every old house has secrets, but when I inherited my great-great-grandmother's Victorian mansion in autumn of 2025, I never imagined I'd find something that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. The floorboards in the master bedroom had creaked for 138 years, hiding a truth so devastating, so beautiful, that it would change not just my understanding of the past, but my entire future. What they buried beneath those wooden planks in 1887 wasn't just a secret. It was a love that defied an empire, a sacrifice that echoed through generations, and a choice that would finally, after more than a century, demand to be heard. My name is Emma Whitmore, and this is the story of how the dead taught me how to live. The inheritance. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and expensive cologne, a combination that made my stomach turn as I sat in the leather chair, still wearing my hospital scrubs from the night shift. I hadn't slept in 26 hours, and the fluorescent lights felt like needles behind my eyes. Mr. Patterson, a man whose jowls seemed to have their own jowls, slid a thick envelope across his mahogany desk with fingers that trembled slightly. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the weight of rehearsed solemnity, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your great-aunt Catherine was quite a remarkable woman." I nodded, though I barely knew her. Great-aunt Catherine had been a distant figure in my life, appearing only in faded photographs and occasional mentions at family gatherings. She'd lived alone in that massive house on Ashwood Lane for as long as anyone could remember, refusing all visitors except for her housekeeper and the mailman. At family reunions, my mother would shake her head and call Catherine the eccentric one, as if that explained everything. "The estate," Mr. Patterson continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "consists primarily of the house itself and its contents. There are some debts, I'm afraid. Property taxes, maintenance costs. The house has been in your family since it was built in 1885. Your great-aunt's will was very specific. She left everything to you." "To me?" I sat up straighter, suddenly alert despite my exhaustion. "Why me?" "She had other relatives. My mother, my uncle. She was quite clear in her instructions." He opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed with age. "She wrote this 30 years ago and updated it every year until her death. She always named you as the sole beneficiary. She wrote, and I quote, 'Emma has her eyes. Emma will understand. Emma must be the one to find it.'" A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the office's aggressive air conditioning. "Find what?" Mr. Patterson's expression suggested he'd asked himself the same question many times. She didn't say, but she was adamant. "The house goes to you, along with one condition. You must spend at least one full night there before you decide whether to keep it or sell it." Those were her exact words. I left the office with a ring of antique keys that weighed heavy in my palm and a head full of questions. The house was mine, apparently, along with whatever mysteries Great-Aunt Catherine had deemed so important that she'd structured her entire will around them. As I drove through the winding streets of Millbrook, Massachusetts, past the coffee shop where I'd had my first date, past the elementary school I'd attended before my parents divorced and we moved to Boston, I felt like I was traveling backward through time. Ashwood Lane was exactly as I remembered it from my one and only visit as a child, a street lined with ancient oaks whose branches formed a cathedral ceiling overhead, their leaves now brilliant with autumn fire. The houses here were monuments to another era, Gothic revivals and Queen Anne's with their elaborate trim work and turrets, each one a testament to the industrial wealth that had built this town in the late 1800s. The Whitmore house stood at the end of the lane, set back from the street behind an iron fence whose gates hung slightly askew. It was enormous, 3 stories of dark stone and weathered wood, with a wraparound porch that sagged in places and a tower room that jutted up into the October sky like an accusatory finger. Windows stared down at me like blank eyes, their glass so old it had begun to ripple and distort. The gardens had gone wild, roses climbing over everything in a riot of thorns and late-season blooms. I sat in my car for a long moment, engine idling, staring at the house that was now mine. Somewhere inside those walls was a secret important enough that a woman I barely knew had waited her entire life to pass it on to me specifically, the rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through nursing school, through double shifts and dying patients and impossible choices, told me this was foolish. I should sell the house, pay off my student loans, maybe put a down payment on a small apartment, but there was another part of me, a part I usually kept buried under practicality and exhaustion, that felt pulled toward that house like iron to a magnet. I'd been sleepwalking through my life for 3 years now, ever since my engagement to David had ended, since I'd watched my dreams of marriage and family dissolve like sugar in rain. I worked, I slept, I worked again. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be curious about anything. The first key stuck in the lock, and I had to jiggle it for almost a minute before the heavy oak door swung inward with a groan that sounded almost human. The smell hit me immediately, dust and old wood, lavender and something else, something I couldn't quite name. Decay maybe, or just time itself made manifest. The entry hall was vast, with a staircase that swept upward in an elegant curve, its banister carved with intertwining vines and flowers. To my left, pocket doors stood open to reveal a parlor frozen in time, furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts at a wedding. To my right, a dining room with a table that could seat 20. Portraits lined the walls, faces from another century staring down with expressions that ranged from stern to sorrowful. I found her in the third portrait, a young woman with dark hair piled high, wearing a dress of deep blue silk. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold, made my breath catch in my throat. They were my eyes, down to the unusual color. A green so light it was almost gray. Mr. Patterson's words echoed in my head. She has her eyes. There was a small brass plaque on the frame, Eliza Whitmore, 1887. Eliza. My great-great-grandmother. I'd seen her name in the family Bible, a name among many, born 1866, married 1885, died 1952. Numbers that gave no hint of the person she'd been, the life she'd lived. But something about this portrait felt different. While the other faces on the wall were painted with the stiff formality typical of the era, Eliza's portrait had a quality that was almost alive. The artist had captured something in those eyes, a defiance, a sadness, a secret. I spent the afternoon exploring, opening doors onto rooms that seemed to multiply the more I searched. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, the books so old their spines had faded to ghosts of color. A music room with a piano that was probably worth more than my car, its keys yellowed like old teeth. A conservatory where dead plants still stood in their pots, their dried stems reaching toward a glass ceiling clouded with dirt. The kitchen was surprisingly modern. Well, modern for 1950 at least. Great-Aunt Catherine had lived here, that much was clear. A coffee cup still sat in the sink. A calendar on the wall was frozen in September, 2 months before her death. There was something deeply sad about these remnants of daily life, the quotidian details that outlast us all. As the sun began to set, painting the western windows in shades of blood orange and gold, I climbed the stairs to the second floor. The master bedroom was at the end of the hall, and I knew it the moment I saw the door. Unlike the others, this one was locked. It took me 3 tries to find the right key, and when the door finally opened, I understood why it had been kept sealed. This room hadn't been touched in decades, maybe longer. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, its canopy dusty but still elegant. A writing desk sat before the window, and I could imagine someone, Eliza perhaps, sitting there in the lamplight, writing letters or diary entries. A wardrobe stood against one wall, and when I opened it, I found dresses that made my heart ache with their beauty. Silk and velvet, lace and embroidery, each one a work of art. But it was the floor that called to me. As I walked across the room, one of the boards groaned under my weight, a sound different from the general creaking of an old house. I knelt down, running my fingers along the wood, and felt what my eyes couldn't see, a slight gap, a place where the boards didn't quite meet. Night had fallen fully now, and the room was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the window. I should have been terrified, alone in this enormous house, kneeling on the floor in a dead woman's bedroom. But I wasn't. I felt, for the first time in years, absolutely present, every sense heightened, every nerve alive with anticipation. I went back downstairs and found a flashlight in the kitchen, along with a screwdriver that would have to do. The board resisted at first, swollen with age and humidity, but finally it came up with a screech of nails on wood that made my teeth ache. Beneath it was darkness and the smell of old paper and cedar. My hands were shaking as I reached down into the gap, and for a moment I thought I'd find nothing, that this would be just another disappointment in a life that had lately seemed full of them. But my fingers touched something, metal, cold and smooth. I pulled it up into the light. It was a tin box about the size of a shoebox, its surface decorated with painted flowers that had faded to ghosts of their former colors. The lid was sealed with wax, and pressed into the wax was a signet ring bearing the Whitmore family crest. I sat there on the floor holding this box that had been hidden for God knows how long, and I realized I was crying. Not sad tears, but something else. Relief, maybe, or recognition. This was what Great Aunt Catherine had wanted me to find. This was why she'd left me this house, with its creaking boards and portrait-lined walls. The wax crumbled easily under my thumbnail, so old it had become brittle. The lid opened with a sigh, and inside I found papers, letters, dozens of them, tied with a ribbon that might once have been white, but had yellowed to cream. Beneath the letters was a leather journal, its pages thick with writing in a careful feminine hand. And at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that disintegrated at my touch, was a photograph. Two women stood side by side, their arms around each other's waists, their faces turned toward the camera with expressions of such joy that it hurt to look at them. One was Eliza, younger than in her portrait, her hair loose around her shoulders. The other was a woman I didn't recognize, tall and elegant, with dark skin and eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds. On the back of the photograph, in that same careful handwriting, were 5 words that would change everything. My heart. My love. C. Constance. I sat there until my legs went numb, reading by flashlight as the old house settled around me with groans and whispers. The letters were love letters, passionate and poetic, written in a voice that was by turns playful and desperate. They spoke of stolen moments and impossible choices, of a love that could not be acknowledged, of a world that would destroy them if their secret was known. The journal was Eliza's, and it told a story that my family had buried along with the truth, the real truth, of who she had been. She'd been married in 1885 to a man named Harrison Whitmore, a union arranged by their families to merge 2 fortunes. But her heart had belonged to Constance, a woman she'd met at finishing school, a woman whose father had been a freed slave who'd made his fortune in shipping. In 1887, when Eliza was 21 and already a mother, she and Constance had planned to run away together, to go somewhere they could be free. The journal entries from that summer were electric with hope and fear, plans made and remade, money hidden away, a future imagined in secret whispers. And then the entries stopped. The last one, dated October 15, 1887, read simply, "Harrison knows. He's taken our baby. He says if I ever see Constance again, if I ever speak her name, he'll make sure I never see our son again. I am buried alive. There is no escape from this tomb." I looked up from the journal, tears streaming down my face, and understood. This house hadn't been Eliza's home. It had been her prison. She'd lived here for 65 more years after that final entry, maintaining the fiction of her marriage, playing the role of dutiful wife and mother while her heart was buried beneath the floorboards with these letters and this photograph. Great Aunt Catherine must have found this box at some point, must have learned the truth about her grandmother. And she'd kept the secret, waiting for someone who would understand, who would recognize Eliza not as the stern matriarch in the portrait, but as a woman who'd loved and lost and survived anyway. "She has her eyes," Mr. Patterson had read. Not just the color, I understood now, but the pain, the longing, the sense of living a half-life. I'd been burying my own heart for 3 years, telling myself that loneliness was safer than risking love again. I'd been living in my own kind of prison, one made of routine and resignation. I sat there on the floor of that bedroom until dawn broke through the windows, reading every letter, every journal entry. I learned that Constance had written to Eliza for years, letters that Eliza had received through a sympathetic maid but could never answer. I learned that Constance had never married, had lived alone in New York City, had died in 1915 during the flu pandemic. I learned that Eliza had wanted to die when she heard that news, but she'd lived on year after year for her children and grandchildren, wearing her grief like a stone around her neck. And I learned that in her final years, she'd asked Great Aunt Catherine to make sure the truth didn't die with her, to find someone who would understand, who would remember that she'd loved and been loved, even if the world never knew. As the sun rose over Ashwood Lane, painting the bedroom in shades of pink and gold, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sell this house. I was going to restore it, to make it beautiful again, to honor the woman who'd lived here in secret sorrow. More than that, I was going to tell Eliza's story. I was going to make sure that her love for Constance was remembered, celebrated, acknowledged in the way it never could be while she was alive. But first, I had to keep reading. There were more letters, later ones, and something about them felt different, urgent. As I untied the second bundle, a smaller envelope fell out. This one addressed in a different hand, bolder, more confident. It was postmarked 1950, just 2 years before Eliza's death. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter inside was short, written on expensive stationery, embossed with an address in Harlem. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore," it read. "You don't know me, but I am Constance's granddaughter. My grandmother spoke of you often in her final years, though she never told me the nature of your friendship until her deathbed. She made me promise to write to you, to tell you that she loved you until her last breath, that she understood why you couldn't leave, that she forgave you for choosing duty over love. She wanted you to know that loving you was the great joy of her life, even if you could only be together in secret, in stolen moments. She died with your name on her lips. I thought you should know that you were not forgotten, that you were loved until the very end and beyond it. Constance left me some things, letters and photographs, and a diary of her own. If you would like to have them, I would be honored to send them to you. Perhaps it would bring you some comfort to know that she kept your memory as sacred as you clearly kept hers. With respect and sympathy, Adelaide Morrison. Toque." Ked behind the letter was a photograph, more recent than the others, probably from the 1940s. An elderly black woman sat in a garden, her face still beautiful despite the years, her eyes still bright, and in her hands, held close to her heart, was a photograph, the twin of the one I'd found, showing 2 young women with their arms around each other, smiling at a camera more than a century ago. The choice: I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. My supervisor, Brenda, was so shocked she didn't even ask for details, just told me to take care of myself and come back when I was ready. I sat on the porch of the Whitmore house, with coffee I'd made in Great-Aunt Catherine's ancient percolator, watching the autumn morning unfold on Ashwood Lane, and tried to process what I'd learned. Somewhere in New York there might be descendants of Constance who had letters and photographs that matched the ones I'd found. Somewhere in the world was the other half of this love story, preserved just as carefully, kept just as secret. The thought made my chest tight with something between grief and hope. I spent the next week living in that house, sleeping in one of the guest rooms, since I couldn't bring myself to use the master bedroom where Eliza had spent so many lonely nights. During the day, I explored every corner, finding more traces of the women who'd lived here. In the library, I found books of poetry with passages underlined, love poems by Sappho and Christina Rossetti, Shakespeare's sonnets with the pronouns sometimes changed in faint pencil. In the conservatory, I found a dried rose pressed between the pages of a gardening journal, with a date written beneath it, June 12, 1886, the day Constance said yes. But I also found traces of Great-Aunt Catherine and her own secret vigil. In her bedroom, smaller and plainer than the master suite, I found notebooks where she'd transcribed some of Eliza's journal entries, adding her own commentary. How did she survive it? Catherine had written in 1975, her handwriting shaky even then. How did she live with this weight for 65 years? I've only known for 5, and it's crushing me. Catherine had discovered the box beneath the floorboards in 1970 while having repairs done to the house. She'd been 53 years old, unmarried herself, living alone in this enormous house full of ghosts. And she'd understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to live a life shaped by secrets and silences. There was a letter from Catherine tucked into one of the notebooks, dated just 6 months before her death. It was addressed to the one who comes after, and I read it with tears in my eyes. "I don't know who you are," she wrote, "but Eliza came to me in a dream and told me you would have her eyes. She said you would be the one who could tell her story in a world that might finally be ready to hear it. I've carried this secret for 30 years, and it's been both a burden and a blessing. A burden because I cannot share it, cannot tell the family the truth about the woman they remember as cold and distant and stern. A blessing because I've been entrusted with a love story so pure and true that it's restored my faith in the possibility of love itself. I never married because I never found what Eliza and Constance had. I never settled for less than that kind of soul-deep connection. The family pitied me, I know, thought I was lonely and strange, but I had their story, their love letters, their photographs. I had proof that the kind of love that moves mountains and defies empires is real, and that was enough. If you're reading this, you've found the box, you know the truth. Now you have to decide what to do with it. You could rebury it, keep the family's respectable reputation intact, or you could let the light in, let the truth be known. Eliza has been silent for so long. Constance has been erased from our family history. Maybe it's time for that to change. I'm choosing you to make this choice because you'll understand the weight of it. You'll know that this isn't just about correcting the historical record. It's about saying that love, all love, deserves to be remembered. It's about refusing to let shame and secrecy have the last word. It's about resurrection. Whatever you decide, know that you've given me hope. Just by existing, just by being someone to whom I can pass this story, you have helped me believe that maybe the arc of the moral universe really does bend toward justice, even if it takes 138 years to get there. With love and hope, Catherine Whitmore. I sat on that porch for hours, watching the neighbors come and go, wondering what they'd think if they knew the truth about the house on the corner. The Harrisons still lived 3 doors down, descendants of the man who'd locked Eliza in this marriage, in this house, in this life. They were nice people, friendly, always waving hello. How would they feel knowing their ancestor had been a jailer disguised as a husband? My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. It was my mother, Ling from Florida, where she'd retired with her 3rd husband. Emma, honey, I heard about the house. Are you really going to keep that old monstrosity? The property taxes alone. Mom, I interrupted, what do you know about Eliza Whitmore? There was a pause. Your great-great-grandmother? Not much. She was before my time. My grandmother, her daughter-in-law, said she was cold, very proper. Why? Did you know she was in love with someone? Really in love? Another pause, longer this time. She was married to Harrison Whitmore for over 60 years. I suppose there must have been some affection there. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of all those years of silence, of a love story so thoroughly buried that even the family had forgotten it was there. Mom, I found something in the house. Letters, a journal. I found the truth about Eliza. I told her everything, watching the maple leaves drift down in the front yard as I spoke. I told her about Constance, about the planned escape, about the choice Eliza had made and the price she'd paid. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Oh my God, my mother finally said, her voice small. Oh my God, that poor woman. All those years. She was crying, I realized. I used to look at her portrait when I was little and think she looked so sad. My mother said that was just how people looked in old photographs, but I knew it was something else. I could feel it. There's more, I said. Constance had a granddaughter who wrote to Eliza in 1950. She might still be alive, Mom. There might be people who have the other half of this story. You have to find them, my mother said immediately. Emma, you have to find them and tell them that we know, that we remember, that... She broke off, crying harder. Tell them that love like that doesn't die just because the world tries to bury it. I hired a private investigator the next day, a woman named Rosa Martinez who specialized in genealogical research. I gave her Adelaide Morrison's name and the New York address from the letterhead, and I waited. While I waited, I started the work of restoring the house. I hired contractors to fix the sagging porch, to repair the roof, to restore the windows. I spent hours in the library, researching the history of queer women in the late 19th century, understanding the context of Eliza and Constance's love. I read about Boston marriages and romantic friendships, about the women who'd found ways to love each other despite a world that denied the possibility of that love. I also started writing. Every night, after the contractors left, I sat at Eliza's desk in the master bedroom, and I wrote her story. I wrote about the girl who'd gone to finishing school and fallen in love with someone her world said didn't exist. I wrote about the impossible choices that society forced on women who dared to love beyond the boundaries of convention. I wrote about survival and sacrifice, about the way love persists even when it's forbidden, denied, buried beneath floorboards. 3 weeks after I'd hired her, Rosa called me. I found her, she said. and I could hear the smile in her voice. Adelaide Morrison is 98 years old and living in a retirement community in Brooklyn. And Emma? She's been waiting for you. I drove to New York the next day, my heart pounding the entire 4-hour journey. The retirement home was nicer than I'd expected, a renovated brownstone with a garden in the back. Adelaide was waiting for me in the sitting room, a tiny woman with Constance's eyes and Constance's smile, wearing a purple cardigan and pearls. "You have her eyes," she said when she saw me, the same words that had been in Catherine's will, Eliza's eyes. Grandma Constance described them so many times. She said they were the color of sea glass, of new leaves in spring. We sat together on a velvet sofa that had probably been there since the 1970s, and Adelaide told me her side of the story. Constance had never married, had lived with a companion named Margaret for 40 years. She'd been a teacher, an activist in the early civil rights movement, a woman who'd channeled her grief into making the world a better place. But she'd kept Eliza's letters and photographs hidden, sacred, a private altar to a love that could never be public. "She told me everything the night before she died," Adelaide said, holding my hand with fingers that felt like bird bones, delicate but strong. She said she needed someone to know that she'd loved and been loved, that her life hadn't been lonely even though she'd never had what the world recognized as a marriage. She said Eliza had been the great love of her life, and even though they'd only had 2 years together before it ended, those 2 years had sustained her for the next 63. 2 years? I asked. But the journal entries. They saw each other in secret, Adelaide explained. After Eliza was married, after her husband found out about their plan to run away. There was a maid at the Whitmore house, a woman named Bridget who, as sympathetic. She would arrange for Eliza to slip away, to meet Constance in the city. It was dangerous, incredibly risky, but they couldn't stay away from each other. They had 2 more years of stolen afternoons and hidden hotel rooms and desperate kisses in darkened carriages before Eliza's husband found out for the second time. That's when he threatened to take the children and institutionalize her, to declare her insane. That's when it finally ended for good. But she kept the letters, I said. She kept the photograph. And Grandma Constance kept hers. She told me where they were hidden, in a false bottom in her wardrobe. She made me promise that if anyone from the Whitmore family ever came looking, I would give them to her. She'd been carrying that hope for 35 years by then, the hope that somehow, someday, someone would remember. Adelaide reached down beside her chair and picked up a wooden box, smaller than mine but clearly a match, the same style, the same painted flowers. "I've kept my promise," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I've been waiting for 68 years. I'm 98 years old and I never thought I'd live to see this day." She opened the box, and inside were letters, dozens of them, in Eliza's handwriting. Letters that Constance had received and treasured, that she'd kept until her death and beyond. There were photographs too, Eliza at 20, Eliza at 30, images that must have been smuggled out of the Whitmore house at great risk. And there was Constance's diary, leather-bound and filled with her thoughts, her love, her grief. We sat together for hours, comparing our boxes, piecing together the full story. We Lau, Gedden cried, 2 women born more than a century after the love story began, brought together by the determination of our ancestors to be remembered. "What are you going to do with this?" Adelaide asked finally. "With the truth?" I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks. I thought about Great-Aunt Catherine's letter, about her faith that I would be the one to let the light in. I thought about Eliza, who'd lived 65 years in silence. I thought about Constance, who'd loved without hope of acknowledgement. And I thought about myself, about the life I'd been living, half asleep, half alive. "I'm going to tell their story," I said. "I'm going to make sure the world knows that they loved each other, that their love was real and beautiful and worthy of being remembered. I'm going to turn the Whitmore house into a museum. A place that celebrates LGBTQ history, that honors the women who loved each other when the world said they couldn't. And I'm going to include Constance in the Whitmore family history where she belongs." Adelaide squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. "Grandma Constance would be so happy," she whispered. "She wanted so badly to be remembered, to be acknowledged. She used to say that the worst part wasn't the separation, it was the erasure, the way society pretended that women like her and Eliza didn't exist, that their love was impossible or unnatural. She wanted to matter. She wanted their love to matter. It did matter, I said fiercely. It does matter. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. The Whitmore Morrison house opened to the public on June 12th, exactly 140 years after the day Constance said yes. We'd restored the master bedroom to its 1887 glory. But now the floorboards were clear glass, and beneath them, protected but visible, were both boxes, both sets of letters, both collections of photographs. Visitors could see the physical evidence of a love that had been hidden for so long, could understand the weight and the courage of keeping such a secret. The other rooms told the story chronologically. The parlor displayed Eliza's and Constance's early letters from finishing school, innocent and playful, before they understood what they felt for each other. The library showed their growing awareness, the moment when friendship became something more. The conservatory held their plans to run away, the hope and terror of imagining a different life. And the tower room, that space that had always seemed to point accusingly at the sky, became a memorial to endurance. We filled it with Eliza's later journal entries, with Constance's diary from her years alone, with the ways they'd each survived the loss of the other. We also filled it with the stories of other women like them, other queer people from the 19th and early 20th centuries who'd loved in secret, who'd found ways to be together despite a world that denied their existence. Adelaide came to the opening, wheeled in by her grandson, and she cried when she saw Constance's portrait hanging beside Eliza's, finally united after 140 years of separation. We'd commissioned them both, working from the photographs, and the artist had captured something essential. The way they'd looked at each other, the way their hands had almost touched in that hidden photograph, the way their love had been written in every line of their faces. The local news covered the opening, and then a national magazine, and then a documentary filmmaker. Eliza and Constance's story resonated with people in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I received letters from LGBTQ elders who'd lived their own lives in hiding, who saw themselves in this story. I heard from young people who were grateful to know that queer love had always existed, that their ancestors had loved and survived and found joy despite everything. But the letter that meant the most came from my mother. "You did it," she wrote. "You let the light in. You refused to let shame and secrecy win. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart, and I think Eliza and Constance would be proud too. You gave them what they never had in life, the freedom to love each other openly, to be remembered not as separate, respectable women, but as what they really were, two people who loved each other with everything they had." 6 months after the museum opened, I was giving a tour to a group of college students when I saw her, a woman about my age, standing in the master bedroom, staring down at the boxes beneath the glass floor with tears streaming down her face. After the tour ended, I approached her carefully. "Are you okay?" I asked. She looked up at me, and I saw in her eyes something I recognized, the same grief and hope and determination that I'd been carrying since the day I found Eliza's letters. "I'm queer," she said simply, "and I've been engaged to a man for 6 months because it's easier, because my family expects it, because I'm afraid of what will happen if I tell the truth. But standing here, looking at what Eliza sacrificed, what she gave up," she wiped her eyes. "I can't do it. I can't marry him. I'd rather live alone and honest than married and buried alive. Does that make sense?" I pulled her into a hug. This stranger who was also somehow a sister, someone who understood the weight of secrets and the cost of silence. "It makes perfect sense," I told her. "And I think Eliza and Constance would tell you the same thing. Love is worth the risk. Truth is worth the cost. You only get one life, and you deserve to live it authentically." She came back a month later to tell me she'd called off the engagement, that she'd come out to her family, that it had been hard but also the most freeing thing she'd ever done. She brought her new girlfriend with her, and they stood in front of Eliza and Constance's portraits, and promised each other that they would never hide, never pretend, never bury their love beneath floorboards. I think about that moment often now, as I live in this house that's no longer a tomb but a testament. I sleep in the master bedroom sometimes, in the bed where Eliza spent so many lonely nights, and I feel her presence not as a ghost but as a blessing. I've put my own bed in the room too, and sometimes I wake up and look at the portraits on the wall, Eliza and Constance, finally side by side, and I tell them about the people who've come to see their story, the lives that have been changed by their example. Adelaide died peacefully in her sleep 2 years after the museum opened, just shy of her 101st birthday. Her family asked if she could be buried in the Whitmore family plot, next to Eliza, and I said yes immediately. At the funeral, her grandson read from Constance's diary, passages about love and hope, and the belief that someday, somehow, the truth woe old be known. Love is not measured in years together, Constance had written in 1916, a year after Eliza's husband died. Too late for them to be reunited. It's measured in the depth of connection, in the willingness to sacrifice, in the courage to choose truth even when the cost is everything. My love for Eliza has sustained me through decades of loneliness. It has made me brave when I wanted to surrender. It has reminded me that I am capable of the kind of love that poets write about, that songs celebrate, that people spend their whole lives searching for. I found it once, and even though I lost it, even though I can never have it again in this life, the fact that I found it at all is a miracle. I've found my own miracle in these last few years. Not a romantic love, though I'm open to that now in ways I wasn't before, but a purpose, a calling, a reason to wake up in the morning that goes beyond just surviving. I've become a keeper of stories, a guardian of hidden histories, a voice for the people who were forced to be silent. The museum has expanded. We've added exhibits on other LGBTQ people from history, other love stories that were buried and forgotten and erased. We've become a resource for scholars, for activists, for anyone who wants to understand that queer people have always existed, have always loved, have always found ways to be themselves even in the most hostile circumstances. And every year on October 15th, the anniversary of Eliza's last journal entry, the day she wrote that she was buried alive, we hold a vigil. We light candles in every window of the house, and we read the letters aloud, and we say their names, Eliza and Constance, and we remember that love buried beneath floorboards is still love, that truth suppressed is still truth, that people denied by history still existed, still mattered, still left their mark on the world. Standing in that house full of light and memory, I understand now what Great-Aunt Catherine meant when she said I would be the one. Not because I'm special or chosen, but because I was ready. Ready to let go of my own fear, ready to stop hiding from life, ready to believe that the truth, however painful, is always better than the prettiest lie. Eliza and Constance waited 138 years for their story to be told. They waited through wars and social movements and revolutionary changes, through the slow, grinding progress toward a world where women who loved women could exist openly, could marry, could be acknowledged. They didn't live to see that world, but their love helped build it, just by existing, just by refusing to disappear completely, even when the world wanted to erase them. Sometimes, late at night, when the museum is closed and the house is quiet, I walk through the rooms and I feel them, not ghosts exactly, but presences, warmths, blessings. I feel Eliza's gratitude for being remembered, for being seen as she really was instead of the respectable matron society forced her to be. I feel Constance's joy that her name is finally spoken aloud, that her love is finally acknowledged, that she's finally, after all these years, part of the Whitmore family history. And I feel my own transformation. From a woman sleepwalking through life to someone fully awake, fully alive, fully committed to making sure that no love story is ever buried again, that no truth is ever sacrificed to respectability or fear. The secret they hid in 1887 wasn't shameful. It was sacred. It was a love so pure and true that it survived 65 years of separation, that it reached across more than a century to change my life and the lives of countless others. It was a love that refused to die, even when it was buried beneath floorboards, even when the world pretended it didn't exist. And now it's a love that lives in the light, that inspires and strengthens and reminds us all that the heart wants what the heart wants, that love is love, and that the truth, however long delayed, will always find a way to rise. I am Emma Whitmore, and I inherited more than a house. I inherited a responsibility, a story, a sacred trust. I inherited the courage of women who loved when love was forbidden, who survived when survival seemed impossible, who kept the truth alive even when they had to bury it. Their love taught me how to live, And now I'm teaching others. One visitor at a time, one story at a time, one truth unearthed and brought into the light, because some secrets are too important to stay buried forever. Some loves are too powerful to be erased. And some truths, once discovered, change everything. This is what they hid beneath the floorboards in 1887. This is what I found. This is what I'm sharing with the world. Love wins, always, eventually. If we're brave enough to let it,